The information and opinions presented in this podcast are based on research done at a particular point in time. The fields of medicine, surgery, psychology, etc. are constantly evolving as new studies and movements happen. Please take into account the year of any particular episode's publication, and as new information presents itself, we will do our best to release updated episodes on the topics. Listener discretion is advised for references to medical terminology of body parts. Unless otherwise stated, no one speaking on this podcast is a medical or legal professional and cannot provide medical or legal advice. Welcome to the Trans Field Guide. To use the terms the internet's using, the true scums versus too cutes. The people who believe that it is a requirement to have X amount of dysphoria to be trans, and that if you do not have dysphoria, you therefore cannot be trans, because otherwise why would you want to go through medically transitioning? And if you're not planning to medically transition, well then you're not trans. Versus the too cutes who believe the exact opposite of all that. As long as you feel in your heart and in your mind that that is what your identity is, then that's good enough.
Yeah, that's just... Oh, drama.
Oh, yeah. So
when I discovered the term true scum and just reading through the comments of all of that, it broke my heart over just like how vitriolic this not debate, it's just an argument, just a vicious battle that's out there.
Debating implies that people are listening to each other.
Where I remember what it was like with, back in high school, it wasn't about coming out as trans. I had no vocabulary for that back then. It was about coming out as bisexual. And that was this huge threat to the concept of homosexuality being a valid sexuality. That, oh, no, I couldn't be bisexual, I had to be on the bi train to gay town. That there were no true bisexuals, or if there were, that through that argument, that it couldn't be a choice. If we throw the world into these binaries, these either-or categories, it's such a neater world. It's just so clean to be able to say it's either this or that. Yeah. That there's only male or there's only female, only XX and XY or whatever. When ultimately the world is really messy. We may have trends, but we're like, the world is just so incredibly messy. And that's also what makes the world really beautiful.
Beautiful when people aren't having discourse all over Tumblr.
Yeah, and I think there is room in the world for there to be that greater diversity without somehow delegitimizing other people's categories. Like even, I don't know, same-sex marriage. From the anti-same-sex marriage side, like, well, your marriage is still valid. Let's also validate this form of love, this expression of love and commitment. So a person's binary gender is totally valid, whether cisgender or transgender, regardless of how other people live and exist. Now, it changes the discourse around that, the way that we talk about all these different things. And so you have to figure out what is it that you're really identifying with.
Kind of bouncing from that, on the medical psychological level, what would you define as the difference between, sex, gender, and gender expression? Because there are some people that, for like genderqueer, for example, you can identify more as closer to one binary or another, but then your gender expression is just all over here in like left field or wherever you want it to be type of thing. And that's one of the arguments that I was hearing recently from somebody who is more on like the transmed, aka the true scum, the side of the argument being that person, I'm not going to name who they are because I don't want to get caught up in any of that mess, but they argued that sex is your physical characteristics, gender is how your brain functions, and then gender expression is how you present to the world. And that because of that, if you don't have dysphoria, that means that your gender expression is the only thing that you're changing. I'm not sure how they jumped to that conclusion, and they didn't explain it very well. But from your perspective, with your experience and learning and all of that, where would you say that the wobbly line between those three would be?
So I always like to acknowledge that language is messy. There's descriptivist ways of understanding language and there's prescriptivist ways of understanding language. We can say language is however we use it. There's also, we can try to define these and then therefore now everyone needs to use it if they're legitimate. Common usage might differ very much from academic usage. I like to refer to what's become the more academic usage of it, where sex is related to usually physiological sex characteristics. So the primary ones being related to sexual reproduction, etc. So typically, the reproductive organs. So genitals, gonads, etc., etc. Secondary characteristics being those that, again, physiological characteristics that don't necessarily involve sexual reproduction, but then are part of how we as a species are dimorphic in that sense, whether that's amount of hair, body fat distribution, etc., etc. Those are going to be sex characteristics, while gender is more that internal sense, which is a lot more vague. So it's how your brain functions, your heart functions, how your soul functions. I try to think very holistically there. So your internal sense of your own identity that is deep and strong and persistent. Even if it's fluid, the fluidity of it may be something that's persistent in that sense. And then yes, gender expression. How do you cue others and communicate your gender to others? I like that gender unicorn graphic that's out there with the Trans Student Education Network that describes those, and you can have those as like sliders or zones where a person can exist. Dysphoria is interesting because people use that in such differing ways. There's just general dysphoria, which you can just say discontent with something, a sense of distress over something. But then gender dysphoria, that winds up being a medical term. That is a DSM diagnosis, which, by the way, is on its way out anyway with the changes to ICD-11 coming in. And I say we're moving away. These things take a decade or more to actually move on. Moving on to the idea of gender incongruence, taking that out of mental disorders and moving it into conditions related to sexual health. But yeah, with that gender dysphoria, we're taking a look at what is the extreme distress that's related to not identifying with your sex assigned at birth and the interactions that you have with society, etc., which is not defining of your identity. It is the experience of that. So I think it's totally possible for people to grow up some form of trans, and if they're already being well accepted, then the clinically significant distress might technically not be there. That instead is just like, oh, I need to figure out how to function in a better way because of my physiological appearance or through gender expression, etc. People wind up trying to cite the DSM as this things like, see, this proves that you have to have dysphoria to be transgender. That's what you see online when you actually pick it up in the introduction to that section. It specifically says you do not have to have gender dysphoria in order to identify as transgender. The thing is that it's copyrighted, etc., so you can't just publish the entire DSM online. It's also mentioned the ICD coding, that you do not have to have gender incongruence in order to identify as transgender. This is different from also being gender nonconforming. Identity is something that is internal, and there isn't an external measure for that, which is something that frustrates doctors, because it's one of the few things where you go to a doctor and you tell them what's wrong and tell them what treatment you're looking for, as opposed to them running some assessment or diagnostic tool and then telling you what's wrong and what to do about it.
And the closest that they can get is go see a counselor or a therapist and bring us a letter, say, where they're saying that, yes, you do indeed have this thing.
Which is a weird system. I love it when doctors work with us counselors, but it's a weird thing to make that a requirement to seek out all the services. Maybe for some screening, but doctors usually go through a psychiatric rotation, so they're supposed to be able to learn how to screen for these things. And when it makes sense to refer to a counselor, yes, go ahead and do that. Even for something, like just plastic surgery. A lot of times they do their own screenings, they'll have their own in-house person. But then if they notice warning signs that someone is acting in a very bizarre way, or they're acting very anxious, or something else is going on, that's where they would say, oh, let's go ahead and have you meet with a counselor first before you engage in, I don't know, a nose job. Yeah. That totally makes sense. Or when they notice that someone is about to undergo chemotherapy, counseling can really help out with going through this tough transition in their life. And at the same time, it would be very strange for a doctor to say, oh, before you can get chemotherapy, any of you, like to a whole group of people, you're going to have to see a therapist to make certain that you're okay to have chemotherapy. That's just kind of weird. But at the same time, when we put it in this category of a mental health disorder, imagine being that doctor. It's like, oh, I'm doing this very physical thing to treat a mental disorder. Shouldn't I have a therapist involved? That's why I'm in favor of switching that over to conditions related to sexual health, where therapists can play this supportive role. And then other things where we clear it for, we want people to be of sound mind and able to consent to medical treatment. That part makes complete sense.
And I know that, kind of very generally speaking, for some of the doctors, the reason why they're like, oh, you have to go and get the letter from the therapist, they do it because the insurance company requires it, which is a whole nother bag of beans. Like this episode? Tell someone about it. Resources referenced in this episode can be found in the show notes at transfieldguide.com. Stay safe, and remember that I'm proud of you.